A few years ago, and where I'm getting with this is the origin of the topic that I want to speak to and for and about this evening with you. The genesis of it was against the backdrop of fermenting discontent out of Iran, political intrigue. And there was a considerable amount of concern in Europe, not exclusively, but principally, about just the population growing exponentially. France, England, and elsewhere where the Islamic population is growing. You're looking at families that will have 7 to 10 kids, as opposed to Europeans that will have 1.5. I hate to be the half. But if you just look at the growing populations and all else, that with there were concerns the extent to which Europe itself is going to be just so influenced and lose its own distinctive European character. That, in conjunction with just fomenting Iranian discontent. It becomes part of the political conversation back then about this, a nuclear Iran. And people were so very concerned. And then that seemed to have gone away, but now it's raising its head again. And even once again, in today's world, Iranian intrigue and all of that, it raises its hoary head. I did a television series, so I work in television, among other things, I entitled it A Bad Moon Rising, and I was looking at Europe principally. And it aired it was Inspirational Network, ABC Family Channel, Daystar, and then God TV into Europe. And I had a former student of mine, Ehab Grace, who went on to, he's from Egypt, he's an Egyptian scholar, a Christian. He wound up going and taking his doctoral dissertation. He did his PhD at Southern Seminary. He did his dissertation on the nature of the relationship between Masoretic text Hebrew and classical Arabic. And what he did, I wanted to do the program in Europe, and it was subtitled in Arabic. It was in conjunction with that I opted to do what I normally don't do. I wanted to weigh in on the subject, and I wrote a book called The Iranian Menace in Jewish History and Prophecy. And I decided to throw in here and speak to, for, and about that, since Jonathan Cahn apparently wasn't available. That I don't know, if I have 20 of these books back there. I just grabbed a few that I had handy. If you're interested, they're back there, and it'll go into more detail than what I'll do here. But what I wanted to do was, in my own way, and I approach theological inquiry much as a detective would approach a crime scene. And I've done that before as a police officer. I've served as a detective. You go there, there's shell casings, there's bodies, there's blood splattering. It's a bit gory. I wasn't there. But there's a theory that that you can, even though you weren't there, by methodically and carefully paying attention to the evidence, you can at least come up with a tentative hypothesis about what happened there. There's a way you look for information, you have a hypothesis, and then you'll gather certain samplings and send them to the lab to see if the physical evidence corroborates the hypothesis. And as you build this, if you can gather the information in such a way where you then can file a probable cause affidavit. This is, in legal language, probable cause is you have specific and articulable facts that would lead a reasonable person to believe that a particular crime has been committed and that a particular person is responsible for it. So you have a cogent case. And then what it is you then serve the warrant. Everyone's innocent until proven guilty, and then the party then has the opportunity to give their spirited defense with the triers of the facts. But to present something, there's something methodical, it's detailed, it's careful. It's not just the proverbial rush to judgment. And the question is, would a disciplined approach to looking at biblical literature, is there a way conceivably to do that, to see if one might arrive at certain conclusions? Now, what I want to do here, I put the presentation together. I want to speak to, for, and about the Iranian menace in Jewish history and prophecy. Now, the crime scene I'm going to, or what we call in academia, primary source data. What I want to do is look at ancient literature. To be sure, I'm interested in biblical literature. And I will look at it very carefully and methodically without unleashing a lot of creative energies. In conjunction with that, what I want to do is look at ancient apocryphal and pseudepigraphical literature. You're looking at literature that comes from the 2nd century BC, extends to the 7th century AD. What I want to do is look at some text to give a window into the way people were seeing, perceiving in century 1. That's what I'm interested in. When Wayne Meeks at Yale says, whenever you open up the Bible, you're kind of climbing back in the New Testament 2,000 years in time. And what I want to do is look at literature from the 1st century. I want to look at biblical literature. If you look at the book of Revelation, you're looking at a book that's written toward the end of the 1st century. What I want to do is look at literature that's contemporaneous with that might give a window into how others might have construed that. So I'm interested here in looking at primary source data, that is 1st century literature, and then I want to engage credible sources that might give a window into the literature. I will take you to the Harvard University Classics Department. I'm going to take you to Columbia University in brief. What I want to do is try and understand a moment. I want to look at one of the more interesting, one of the more difficult, one of the more well-known eschatological texts. And I want to endeavor to explore it and then expand upon it and then have a conversation with you about that. You with me on that? Sure. Kind of, sort of? Okay. It's a little different. That's the title. This is The Crazy Guy. And there's a note here, discuss problems inherent in eschatological inquiry and my associated reticence. I've been rather reluctant. For me, in part, when I hear individuals talk about Bible prophecy and what's happening today, sometimes, to me, it doesn't comport with my own interior canons of acceptability. I want to be open to new ideas. It's like opening up a window. You want to be open to fresh air blowing in, but you want to throw down the screen to keep the bugs out. And you want to be open to what the Lord might be saying and doing and what have you. And you want to have an open mind and an open heart. But you don't want to surrender your critical apparatus, on the other hand. And especially when it comes to the world of Bible prophecy and individuals that are offering a telling of it. To me, I don't know where good scholarship, I don't know where that is. I don't know if it's just creative imaginations and someone says, well, the Lord told me and I feel and the Spirit said, and I don't want to discredit or disparage, but for me, I could. Here's this, I could write a book, this Jewish Christian scholar, Cambridge University, this, Bible prophecy, and I could get some short-term traction. People go, well, yeah, he would seem to be in the know. But I don't want to sell credibility that I developed over the years for just a few scraps of attention for a moment in time that might not be worth much a few years later. You with me on that? So for me, to speak too foreign about Bible prophecy, it comes replete with its own problems. But I think that if individuals who endeavor to be serious and responsible, Bible teachers and professors, if they don't engage these things, then you just give it over to the crazies by default. They're the only voices in town. And so I think women and men that have a more careful approach to it, at the risk of commending myself to you, need to get into the game. So what I want to do here, there's a few things on the quick. Number one, I want to examine both text and context for what is perhaps the best known end times verse in all of Scripture from the book of Revelation. So on the front end, I want to look at what's one of the more popular texts. I want to examine it. Secondly, after looking at this first century literature, toward the end of the century, called Revelation, I want to examine briefly intertestamental history and apocalyptic literature that comes as a result of all that. Or within that context, understand how first century hearers might have understood the text. I'm interested in a text, one text. And then I want to understand. I don't want to look at the text and go, oh, well, look, here's what it says here. And you look today, my God, it's amazing because I just read in the Wall Street Journal or Fox News. I don't want to just look at the biblical text on the one hand and the newspaper in the other and go, look. Not that that's unimportant to raise the question, how might a biblical text be fulfilled in our day? That's not an unreasonable question. It's not an impossible question. And there's truth associated with it. But I don't want to rush into that space. What I want to do is look at first century literature. And then I want to try and understand it. Not the way someone today, look at Iran and nuclear deal and Biden and getting behind all. What I want to do is look at a first century text, not the way a modern would engage it, but the way someone in the first century would engage it, by looking at literature that might have some bearing. Thirdly, time permitting, I want to pivot from eschatology to protology. Eschatology speaks of last things. Protology speaks of first things. And I'm interested in looking at a Revelation text, context. I want to expand it beyond just the biblical world to look at some intertestamental literature that gives a window into it. Speaks too foreign about the same things, interestingly, but it's not a canonical source. Then what I want to do is go back to the biblical text and look at the Revelation, eschatology, look at protology, and examine how the verse intersects with the dawn of human history and carries through till it's dusk. And then we'll consider some applications. If you're thoroughly confused, blame my wife. She writes all my messages, says, just stay with the notes, Jeffrey, and you'll do fine. So, Barry will be here next time. Now, what I want to do is speak briefly to what I'll refer to as the prelude to the final conflict. I'm interested, if you will, open your Bibles, please, to the book of Revelation, chapter 16. The book of Revelation, what's revealed, Revelation is about as clear as mud. To call it, here's what's revealed. It's confusing, but I want one text to be the object of our attention, a text that is perhaps the best known text, even amongst people that don't have any religious agenda to speak of. Today people speak of churched and unchurched. It's not my preferred language. But even people that are unchurched, that don't operate with a Christian agenda, there's not even any pretense If you would ask, they would tell you they're disinterested. Even those people that have no interest and no experience know something about this. Now, the text itself, what they know about, you'll see the last word here is, and they gathered them in the last sentence, verse 16, they gathered them together to the place called in Hebrew Armageddon. The term Armageddon itself, even amongst those without any Christian worldview or interest in acquiring one, even individuals with the secular mind, and secular comes from the Latin secularis, meaning pertaining to this age. They're interested in this world, not things spiritual, not in the next. Even amongst those, when you say the word Armageddon, they would say, oh yeah, Armageddon, that talks about some, ragged conflict, some great conflagration at the ragged edge of time. Some war that has some kind of religious, spiritual, prophetic significance. World War III on steroids. Now, I want to read the text. Then the sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates. Now, if I read it, you say, I don't know what he's talking about. Don't worry about it. You don't have to. The sixth angel, he says, poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up so that the way of the kings from the east might be prepared. And I saw three unclean spirits like frogs coming out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are spirits of demons performing signs and wonders which go out to the kings of the earth and of the whole world, to gather them to the battle of the great day of God Almighty. Behold, I am coming as a thief. Blessed is he who watches and keeps his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame. And they gathered them together to the place called in Hebrew Armageddon. Text. That's the text. We're going to make that text the object of our attention. Object comes from a Latin word meaning to throw at, to throw light at something. Eject means to throw out. Subject means to throw under. Object, throw at. What we want to do is just kind of pick through that a little bit, like a detective, going to a crime scene. Is there any trace evidence, anything here? That's the text. Now, the context. What you're looking at here, you say, well, there's so much in that I don't understand. Okay, what do you understand? Let's begin there. When you look at the literature, we're at the ragged edge of the Bible. In the 16th chapter, we're looking at an apocalyptic description of the ragged edge of time. There's some great war. It's referred to as the Battle of Armageddon. Now, if you look at the 16th chapter, and what I want to do is just briefly go through the context. I don't want to make any executive decisions. And I think people move too quick to make executive decisions. One opens up a biblical text. Well, here's what I feel the Spirit is saying. What do you think? Well, I don't care about your feelings. I think rather than jump to here's what I feel, you want to look at the literature, make observations, interpretations, and applications. Just observe. If you look at the literature, in the 16th chapter, there are depictions of horrific judgments. There's a world, whatever the meaning is, there's a world that's knocked out of kilter. There's woes that are unleashed. There's decay, despair, disorientation, finally culminating in this climactic war in the 16th chapter. In 17 and 18 then, after that attended to, there's this evil empire in the world that's described and its destruction is foretold. In the 19th chapter then, you have this ultimate triumph of God in human history, whatever it means. This is where Jesus Christ comes, with triumphalism on the red horse, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, kicks some butt. I mean, it's a contest. I mean, there's a sense, and if you look at the literature, if you look at Revelation, if you just look at the trajectory of it, I mean, whatever the meaning of the various nuances are, there's a world that's embroiled into decay, disorientation. It's sinking to a nadir, to a low point. In graphic terms, the zenith is the high water mark, the nadir is the low point. There's a world that's cascading downward, going from bad to worse and worse yet, until you get to the 19th chapter. All of a sudden, heaven opens up, and you have in there the story of Christ returning, Christ triumphant, with an army with him, and you have this conflagration, the battle. In the 20th chapter, this is where I'm interested in eschatology and protology. Eschatology speaks of last things. Protology speaks of first things in biblical literature. If you look at the way it's ended, after this war where Christ shows up, then you have the language of the text in the 20th chapter, and he took this serpent of old, Satan, and threw it in a pit. Kind of harks back to Gan Eden, to Eden, where there was the serpent, the archetypal evil. And then you have this motif in the Revelation of paradise restored. Here we are in the city of God, and there's the waters of life, and there's the tree of life, and there's healing for the nation, and there's no longer sorrow or sighing. All of that is vanquished. And again, when you look at the ragged edge of the Bible, eschatology, it throws back to protology, the very beginning of the literature. For when you go back to Bereshit, to Genesis, therein is the story of Adam and Cheva, Adam and Eve, who are placed in paradise, Gan Eden, paradise from the Latin enclosed garden. And all of a sudden, psst, hey lady, psst, you hungry? Psst, snake, it's really in the Hebrew a hissing creature. Psst, hey, subtle. And there's the tree of life. There's the seizing of the fruit. There they are in Eden, that's characterized by association with rivers, and they're thrown out of Eden. They're thrown out of paradise. They're cast out to the east, and they make their way in a tougher environment. Now, there's a sense in which, when you look at the Revelation text, you have this paradise restored motif in Revelation, and in Genesis you have paradise lost at the beginning. And we're here at a section in the literature that notes that in advance of this ultimate triumph of God in human history, you have this struggle. It culminates in this battle called Armageddon. Well, here's what the crazy professor wants to do. 3 steps. Number 1, observation, interpretation, and application. What I want to do, crazy professor just wants to make observations. What do you see? What do you think you see? And then, what do you think it means? And then, how might it apply? But everything begins with careful observations. That's the difference. You can go, you can speak to a girlfriend. Hey, look, I'm a little sore. I have a headache. Well, what do you think? And your friend can say, well, maybe you ought to take this, maybe you ought to take that. Now, you go to the doctor's office, and the physician comes out, and here's what I'm thinking. Then they start feeling around. You go to a doctor, they feel this. For God's sake, it's a neck. What are they even looking for? They put a stethoscope here, breathe. For God's, but what it is you're dealing with someone that the difference is they have a much more disciplined sense of awareness and hearing. There's palpation, touch, there's observation, there's sight, there's auscultation, there's hearing. There's a much more finely tuned sense of they've cultivated the aptitude to listen to what you're saying, to what your body is saying. And with that, then, to be able to proffer a tentative hypothesis of what may or may not be happening, subject to it being sent out for tests. It all begins with observing first. What do you think you're looking at? And it's that careful look, that sensitive touch. What do you think you're looking at? What do you think it might mean and how it might apply? Well, here's what we're looking at. I want to just take a look at the passage again. I kind of gave it to you in the front end, but I want to give you an example of just making certain observations. This is the text, we've already read it, the passage. But let's note some particulars. I've already alighted upon this. If you look at this passage, whatever these strange nuances are, at the end, it mentions the word Armageddon, which, by the way, is an actual literal place. Armageddon is just some spiritual thing. If you look in Israel, Armageddon is right there at the Jezreel Valley. Any conventional forces that are moving into the region, if you look at the topography of Israel, there's green areas, but it's very arid and dry. If you're moving tens of thousands of troops and you're wanting them to marshal in advance of a conflict for a war in Jerusalem, after especially coming through a desert place, they need to be able to go someplace where they can regroup, where they can energize, where they can drink, where they can eat, and then go into the struggle. Armageddon has always been the place in the ancient Near Eastern world. There in Armageddon, there's 22 different layers there in the archaeological site of fortifications. It was understood whoever controlled this space controlled the Jezreel Valley. Whoever controls the Jezreel controls the way into Jerusalem. It was always construed as very strategic, going back millennia. Now, as I'd noted at the outset, Armageddon is perhaps the best known word in the Bible amongst those that don't even know the Bible. Individuals with no experience at all know that it represents. So whatever's happening here in this odd text, it leads to this great conflagration. Now, I want to alight upon, behold, I am coming as a thief. Blessed is he who watches and keeps his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame. Strange expression. Quotation marks, appropriately so. Now, if you look at the book of Revelation, it's called, the revelation of Jesus Christ. Misnamed maybe at one level. The reason why I say that, if Grace Church is putting on a play, the book of Revelation, and you get assigned to play the part of Jesus Christ, don't get too excited. You don't get a lot of speaking parts. If you look at the book of Revelation, Jesus, if you have a red letter edition of the Bible where the things that Jesus said are noted in red, if you look at the book of Revelation, you have Jesus' statements in the first 3 chapters. After that, he might as well be out for coffee. You hear Jesus initially, and then whatever's going on, he doesn't appear at all until here. And then after this, in the book of Revelation, behold, I'm coming soon, But this is the longest statement. This is the longest book. This is the longest, if you look at these revelation, these visions, this is the longest speaking part of Jesus Christ. So you're looking at this great conflagration, this war to end all wars, according to the literature. And it's to be observed, never mind what it means, but it's to be observed that this is one of the only speaking parts that Jesus Christ has in the apocalyptic section of the apocalypse. It's an exhortation in advance of a great conflagration. Just observations. Another one. If you look at, not only does whatever this story is about, it ends at the Battle of Armageddon. The actual Armageddon conflict is preceded with an exhortation from a speaking part of Jesus. But if you look at the events that lead up to the Armageddon story, we're told there's this angel that pours out this bowl on the great river Euphrates. Its water was dried up, that the way of the kings from the east might be prepared. Now, the east of what? The east of the Euphrates. There's a story here where the Euphrates River is dried up, and this then, forces that are marshaled, that are amassed on the eastern side of the Euphrates, then enter into the region according to the story. And these are going to be the principal forces that push this climactic battle. Okay. Now, there's some value in understanding what might be east of the Euphrates, what was east of the Euphrates back then, what countries are we talking about, what's going on here, what are we looking at? Now, if you want to kind of push it ahead a little bit, if you look at where are we when we're looking at the Euphrates and the Tigris, you're looking at Iraq and then Iran. So here's a sense in which, great end times war driven along by demons and stuff, and it precipitates this conflict in the region, and it's all out with prophetic significance. These people are coming to attack the Israeli nation state. What you need, if you're going to have this war, you need to have the Israelis back in the land as a state. And you need to have this wicked empire to the east, hell-bent on getting into the region and duking it out. So, I mean, a reader looks at this and goes, that's why I want you to resist the temptation to be overly excited. You have a story of, you have miraculously, against all odds, you do have the resurrection of an Israelite nation state in the ancestral homeland. It's the center of world attention. And you do have forces principally from the east that seem to be particularly bellicose, particularly given to warring, spirited along, wanting to, engage in the fight. So someone can look at the literature and jump to, an ancient text, a modern newspaper article. I'm not saying don't make the leap, but I'm saying don't make any leaps yet. All that I want to do is dig around the story. It's worth observing here. Whatever this final conflict is, it's precipitated by forces east of the Euphrates. And that it says the kings of the east, it's just not one. Apparently there's some kind of federation that are game to kind of jump into the fray. We're told as well in verse 14, they're driven along by spirits of demons, performing signs. By the way, the word demon in modernity, understandably, has a particularly nefarious connotation, evil. It's worth noting in century 1, the word demon itself, in and of itself, didn't have a negative connotation. It's just a way of saying spiritual beings, the spiritual world, the unknown. And of these demons, some were good and some weren't. Good spirits, evil spirits. But certainly here, it's evil on steroid. That whatever's happening here, whatever's energizing all this, it's fair to say that it comes from the underworld. And what it does is it stirs up not just these forces that are coming from across the Euphrates, according to the text, but it goes out to the whole world to bring them to the battle of the great day of God Almighty. So if we take the literature to mean what it says, it's not just a regional conflict. There's something about this thing that it galvanizes world attention. Now you can take a leap. I mean, if you look at Israel, it's no bigger than the state of New Jersey. It's in the news all the time. Was it about that little place over there that it's in the news? I mean, you can take the leap. But what I want to note here is just picking around the literature. Remember, we're just being crime scene detectives. We're just looking at the evidence that's lying around. If we want to understand something, it's like you're a detective, you're at a crime scene. You weren't there when it happened, but you have arrived. I mean, you're not from century 1, you're from 2022. We're looking at it. We have arrived, and we're looking at it. And apparently there's some conflict that you have this fermenting discontent. It spills over from east of the Euphrates. It comes into the region. It's driven along by nefarious forces. It draws others into the vortex, into the unhappiness, into the tensions, and it culminates in a great battle. What we call the battle, what we call the Battle of Armageddon. Now, what we've done is we've looked at literature. What I want to do here is remind you that a picture's worth 1,000 words. What I want to do here is just give you a picture into Revelation's world. This is a visual depiction of the world east of the Euphrates in the first century Roman world, from whence invading hordes come in Revelation. Now, so what we're looking at here, it doesn't say Iran, it says Parthia. Now you'll note you have Parthia over here to the east. Now, you know, the Tigris and Euphrates are there. You'll see it in another map. Here's where Israel is. Here's the Roman Empire in the gray, and there's of course, the Mediterranean world, and to the east of it here, of course, is Israel. But Parthia, I want to speak in some detail about Parthia because whatever you might be inclined to think of when you hear war, barbaric hordes east of the Euphrates sweeping into the region, whatever you might think of, well, that's Iran. The word Iran didn't exist. In this world, it's Parthia, and it's worth discussing. Now, that's century 1. Here's the modern world, and again, you can see here we're looking at, this is the world that we inhabit. Here's Iran and Iraq, and right here I'm pointing to the Tigris and Euphrates River. So this is what we call Iran today. Evil empire, well, whatever you want to say about it. I want to pull a source here because I said I want to look at primary source data, but here I want to take you to Columbia University here to a word from Professor Ishan Yarshader, who explains the origin of the word itself, Iran. This part of the world wasn't even referred to as Iran until recently, interestingly, till the 1930s. And the reason why it was named Iran, it was known previous to this as Persia in modernity. But the reason why the name was changed in the 30s to Iran is because the powers in the region there were currying favor with the Nazis. And the Nazis cast a vision for an Aryan race. And the word Iran is the same word as Aryan. That is, we're of the same ilk. Now, this is Professor Yarshader. In 1935, the Iranian government requested those countries which it had diplomatic relations with to call Persia Iran, which is the name of the country in Persian. The suggestion for the change is said to have come from the Iranian ambassador to Germany, who came under the influence of the Nazis. At the time, Germany was in the grip of racial fever and cultivated good relations with nations of, quote, Aryan blood. It is said that some German friends of the ambassador persuaded him that, as with the advent of Reza Shah, Persia has turned a new leaf in its history and had freed itself from the pernicious influence of Britain and Russia, etc. And it was only fitting that the country be called now by its own name, which is Iran, associated with Arian. Well, that's why it's a mistake, by the way. When people think of Islamic intrigue in the ancient Near Eastern world, it would be a grave mistake to refer to Iranians as Arabs. They would decry the connection. Even the brand of Islam that carries in Iran is a different kind. It's not Sunni Islam, it's Shia. And Shia, by the way, is driven by an eschatological vision to bring in the world's end. It's kind of like Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth, Islamic style. There's a real prophetic edge to it. There's an understanding of a calling, of a destiny to facilitate a great war. It's an interesting connection. In any case, when you look at today's world, there's a country east of the Euphrates that is hostile to the West, to Israel, fomenting discontent. It's just worth observing that. I don't want to do anything with it. I just want to observe it. So what I wanted to do, the crazy professor's three-step process. Crazy professor, 3 steps. Observation, interpretation, and application. What I wanted to do was just look at an interesting text of literature and make certain observations that I think it's just there. I don't want to get carried away with it, but there's things that are just worth observing. I don't want to be too quick to connect any dots. I just want to observe. Now, having considered the passage, if I ask if anyone wanted to propose any tentative interpretations without trying to apply too firmly. Now, in your mind, you might be sloshing some things around, but it's more stated here rhetorically. You naturally can think, well, wait a minute, maybe the crazy guy on stage is onto something here, Now that he mentions it, that there's a story in the Bible that seems to be kind of congruent with a narrative in the world. Resist the temptation. Don't jump yet. Never mind applications. First you make observations. You make, well, I think I interpret this means that. I'd avoid it. What I want to do is move on. I'd mentioned at the outset that what I want to do is I want to look at primary source data. What that means is I want to look at the principal literature. By the way, I think personally it's a mistake in church. In church there's too little Bible. Sometimes it's like, the preacher, it's pop psychology, it's something that's on his or her mind they want to share. Oh, but it's church, so I better find a verse at the front and at the end because it's church. But really, the enterprise is all about what's on their minds and to find some language in the literature that kind of dovetails with it. Now, I don't want to disparage topical messages, but I think that more attention needs to be paid to primary source data. That it's better rather than someone walk out of here and say, or here or anywhere to say, oh, Reverend, that was a good message. Who cares? People ought to walk out here and say, now that Bible is a really interesting book. To develop some appreciation for the source material. Perhaps then that individual might open it up during the week. To say, boy, that's a really good story. I'd rather do a lousy job of teaching the Bible than a good job of just being cool and interesting. So primary source. Certainly, if you're wanting to look at Bible prophecy, the end of the world, what's up, certainly the Newer Testament is primary source literature. But I don't want to just look at that. I want to see if there's other things from that era that might help me understand that. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. And so what I want to do is not just look at the New Testament. Briefly, what I want to do is talk about the intertestamental world. Because what I want to do is climb into the world that serves as the background for Century 1, and in the process, help you understand a little bit about the world of Parthia. If you look at the Old Testament world, now I'm going back 400 years, Judea, at the end of the Old Testament, is annexed as a Persian province. If you look at Older Testament history, you know, the Israelite kingdom had enjoyed autonomy for a season. It's going to be overrun by the Assyrians, it's going to be overrun by the Babylonians, it's going to be overrun by the Persians. When the Old Testament comes to a close, Judea is a Persian colony on lease. What's going to happen to the Persians is Alexander the Great is going to get the better of them. You have, you might recall the Persians made a bid for the Greeks. If you remember the movie 300 Spartans. Later on, Philip of Macedon's son, Alexander, wanted to exact the vengeance of the Greeks. And so he goes after the Persians with verve. Judea then, Persia is going to fall to the Greeks with Alexander, and Judea in Alexander's world is going to become a Greek holding. So if you look at Judea, it enjoyed a season of autonomy. It was an Assyrian holding, a Babylonian holding, a Persian holding, and now it's a Greek holding. Alexander dies, and the empire's his generals are fighting over it with Judea there in the middle. It's a Seleucid holding, which is out of Syria for a season, and then it pivots to the Egyptians. You know, Judea is right there between these major world empires and gets absorbed in one and the other. It gets bounced around. Judea, as we are moving further away from the Old Testament world, getting closer to the New Testament world, Judea enjoys a season of autonomy, and then eventually there is this group that comes from the Etruscans in Italy that's gaining momentum in the Mediterranean world, following a variety of wars referred to as the Punic Wars. The Romans are able to get supremacy at sea. They'll name the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, which means our sea, and they're expanding. You're looking at Roman power that's building. In the 60s BC, Rome is going to annex Judea as one of its holdings. Actually, Pompey is in Antioch, Syria, looking to bring Antioch into the fold. And what happens in conjunction with that, Judea gets absorbed. Now, I want to take a look at the map and give a little bit of detail. Here we're looking at the Mediterranean world again. We're looking at the Roman Empire, the world from 44 BCE, before the Common Era, to 117. And of course, here's the Mediterranean Sea, here's Judea. And you see over here, it's not colored, it's Parthia. Parthia. If you look at the Roman world, the way the Romans looked at the world, there was one group in particular that the Romans were particularly disdainful of. And you know who that was? The Parthians, just east of Syria here, right over here. In fact, when Rome came into the region, Pompey was bringing Antioch into the fold. And when Antioch is brought into the fold, it's a major staging area for the Romans. It's very significant. In Judea, the Roman representative was a procurator, as in to procure. The head in Antioch was a legate, It's someone of senatorial rank. It's a higher rank, it's a more significant position. And if you look at the Roman world in Jesus' day, there were a number of legions that were garrisoned up here in Syria. And the reason why they were garrisoned there is they wanted to have a hedge against the Parthians. You go half a century BC, the Romans had suffered their most inglorious defeat at the hands of the Parthians. Have you ever heard the term barbarian? The term barbarian kind of harks to these wild and woolly, uncivilized folk. The word barbarian is just a word that means non-Greek. There's a sense in which we are the civilized, and it's these people outside of the bounds of civilization. Parthia is where the barbarians were, the hordes. Right away, when you hear the literature and talks about these hordes, these evil sorts that are marshaled east of the Euphrates, and they're coming in, making an assault on empire. I mean, there's a way people in that world would have understood that language. Parthia, let me tell you the story. Once upon a time, there was a slave revolt. If you can recall Spartacus and the slave revolt. And these slaves rallied to Spartacus. If you look at Roman civilization, it was run by slave stock. Once there was a movement on the Senate floor to require slaves in Rome to wear a patch to note that they were slaves. But it was voted down squarely because they didn't want the slaves to know how many there were. They could have easily thrown off the Romans. In fact, the Romans only had, they had a Spartan force in the city of Rome itself. When Roman generals would come back from war, they weren't allowed to bring their legions into the city for fear these powerful generals might take over the city. They had to be kept on the western side of the Rubicon. And the expression crossing the Rubicon is throwing down, it's tantamount to a declaration of war. You have a limited force in the imperial city itself. Rome was driven by a slave economy. The slaves start to discover each other. There's a revolt. And there's reasonably good success. But the wealthiest man in Rome, his name was Marcus Licinius Crassus Dives, a.k.a. Crassus, wasn't going to tolerate that. He himself funded a few legions. Legion, you're looking at 5,000 or so soldiers and just as many auxiliaries that are looking to earn a place in the legion. He funded a number of legions to put down the slave revolt. See how I can take that from a slave? He has success, subsequent to which then, as a way of saying thank you for bringing stability to the empire, the Senate opts for some kind of triumvirate where leadership would be shared. You have Caesar, you have Julius, who's made a name for himself against the Gauls in the West, which would be the modern France. You have Pompey, who's made a name for himself in the East. And then you have Crassus, who's made a name for himself beating slaves. Well, Crassus was unhappy because they said, look, these others fought real armies. All Crassus did was beat slaves. Well, what Crassus does, he uses his position to galvanize forces to go on an ill-fated campaign in the East. What he's going to do, he's going to show them. And what does Crassus do? Crassus goes to Parthia, brings tens of thousands of soldiers into Parthia. He is defeated so squarely that in the annals of history, the slave price dropped in the market because there was a glut of Roman soldiers now become slaves. It brought the price down. You know, it's all supply and demand. But to add insult to the injuries, not only did the Parthians defeat the Romans, but the Romans lost their eagles, these legions. Now, in military culture, your insignia, your standard, you know, there's religious significance, there's pride, there's your unit. And you know, I don't have any experience in the military, but I do in police culture. Your badge, your unit, your rank, that means something in guy culture. Rome was obliterated, the standards were taken. Rome was looking, subsequent to that, for treaties to get the standards back. It was deemed such a blemish, such an insult. There's disdain, chagrin, there's tension, there's this understanding of these hordes, these barbarians. Now, there's some value in understanding intertestamental history, because when you open up the book of Revelation and you're looking at a story that comes out of the Greco-Roman world about these forces that are marshaled east of the Euphrates, sweeping into the region, and there's a war, there's a sense in which that's going to cohere with the sensibilities of those people in that world. And by the way, there's not only that war. If you go back to a simpler map here, you're looking at Parthia. If you look at the founding of Judea, oh, I should say, by the way, the reason why here you have Parthia and this buffer zone, if you look at Antioch, there were a number of legions that were stationed there. They wanted to provide a hedge. It was everything in the east was set up to provide a hedge against Parthia, even Judea. When you enter into the New Testament world, you hear about Herod, King Herod. Well, there's a number of Herods. There's Herod Philip, Herod Antipas, this Philip, and this Herod and that Herod. Herod is a dynastic name. It's like you want to talk about France, King Louis. Which one? The 14th, the 13th? I mean, there's a number. Or you look at Egypt, Pharaoh. Pharaoh's a title name. If you look at the guy, if you look at his birth certificate, it didn't say Pharaoh, P, on his driver's license. It's a title name that's given. Now, if you look at Herod, what had happened, the way Herod came to power in the region, actually, if you look at the first Herod, Antipater, he was an Edomite. He wasn't even of Jewish extract originally. There's a way that he was assimilated into the Jewish world. And he did secure some power with these emerging Romans. What happens is Parthia invades Judea. And the Romans had it divided up. There was Faisal, one of the Herodians, who was given a governorship of the northern part, the Galilee and what have you. And then another at the south, the Herod that we know. What happens is you have Parthian intrusion. Faisal is killed. And the Parthians are meddling. They're looking to take over Judea, and the Romans won't have it. What happens is Herod, after the death of his brother, he's going to go take his family and deposit them at a place called Masada, a fortress. Then after that, he himself is going to go to Egypt and speak to Elizabeth Taylor. That's what happens. He goes to Egypt. He wants Elizabeth Taylor to help, sometimes referred to as Cleopatra. What happens is Cleopatra doesn't deliver. Then Herod goes to Rome. And he talks here, more Parthian intrusion. The East can crumble. And he commends himself. If the Romans will get behind him, he will provide a secure bulwark against the barbarian hordes. Even Jesus told a parable in the New Testament about this person, this powerful man who went away for a while to secure a kingdom, and then he came back. His hearers would have understood he's referring to the story I just told. Again, it's always helpful. The first interpretation of a text belongs to the original hearers. It's important to try and reconstruct a moment from the primary sources and understand it the way they would have heard it. Now, what happens is Herod goes to Rome. The Senate will convene because it's a crisis. It's the Parthians again, the Nemesis. And the Senate convenes. And summarily, the Senate unanimously opts to make Herod a client king, the king of Judea. And Mark Antony and Julius will then take Herod up out of the Senate hall, up the Palatine Hill, and put the decree and just kind of ratify the decree. What happens is Herod leaves and becomes the Herod that we know of in the Bible. And he's commended with the principal task to provide a loyal client king. And the principal interest, again, is to stave off the Parthians. To reiterate the point that we're looking at a text. We're considering a text. Here, it's this passage, Revelation 16, 12 through 16, where the author here is looking at, civilization unraveling, this final undoing, this final conflict. We'll be quick to say, well, that's Iran today. Look, okay, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But how would they have heard it? Now, what I want to do is introduce you to some primary source literature that would give you a window into understanding perhaps the way they understood. Because if you're looking at the New Testament, it's not the only literature from that part of the world in that sliver of time. I taught a course on the Dead Sea Scrolls. You're looking at a sect, at a group that goes from about 150 or so BC into the 60s AD. There's a 200-year window of time. Individuals that are looking with biblical text, and they're managing it a certain way. The sectaries at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scroll, what's that all about? There's other genre, there's different types of literature. What I want to do briefly is speak to you about apocryphal and pseudepigraphical literature. I know when I say that, it sounds like we're at a Pentecostal camp meeting. He's speaking in tongues. What I want to do is, I'll explain that. There's different types of literature. I want to introduce you to Professor Collins from Yale University with his translation of what's referred to as the Sibylline Oracles. Now, we're not looking at New Testament text, but the Sibylline Oracles here come from a book that is referred to as the Old Testament pseudepigrapha. Pseudepigrapha means false names. There's literature from the ancient world, the Book of Enoch, that it's claiming the name of a biblical character who didn't write it, but pseudepigrapha, a fake name, like a pseudonym. What I want to do is read to you from what are referred to as the Sibylline Oracles. We're looking at literature that goes from 200 BC, and then it's redacted, it's edited, it kind of bleeds over, goes through the New Testament world time-wise. And it just gives a window into what they were thinking. Now, this literature, the Sibylline Oracles, we're not looking at canonical text, but very, very influential. You can read Literature Today on Leadership, John Maxwell, Steve Riggle, this person and that. It's not the Bible, but it's influential because of who these people are and what they represent for those of us that want to learn from them about what it is that they seem to do better than we do. If you look at the literature, Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, it's not canonical literature. In fact, the Jews considered it deuterocanonical. That is, it's not canonical, but it's helpful. It's an ancillary source. Later on, the Roman Catholic Church is going to turn around and take the Apocrypha and make it canonical. But if you look at Jerome's Vulgate in the fourth century, the first Latin Bible, it didn't have the Apocrypha. Later on, people are going to make claims about it. But the literature has value, not inspirational. Inspiration, the inspiration of Scripture comes from the Latin in spiritus. It means to breathe spirit in. The sibling oracles, so-called, it's not inspirational literature in the classical sense. But if you look at the church fathers, the writers, you have the apostolic era, the writers of the New Testament, you have the sub-apostolic era, the next generation, you have the post-apostolic era, the generations after. If you look at the sibling oracles, they're quoted hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times by these ancient church writers who were close to the apostles themselves. It speaks of a certain kind of influence. There are times in the New Testament they even quote these sources. You look in the book of Jude and it says, and when the devil was contending with the archangel Michael about the body of Moses, well, where does it say that? It doesn't say it in the Bible. You have it in apocryphal sources. In any case, the sibling oracles are quoted by the church fathers. You might know of it if you've ever heard of the Sistine Chapel, when Pope Sistus built a room and Michelangelo painted on it. You're familiar with, reach out and touch someone, that Michelangelo, tells the story there in pictorial form of creation. And you have God, a muscular kind of Herculean deity, kind of reaching out with his hand and touching Adam. Are you familiar with the story? So here's God with his one hand is reaching down to touch Adam. You know what he's doing with his other hand? He has his arm around a naked woman, Sophia. If you look at the Sistine Chapel, there's depicted there, you have these pictures of the Bible, very interesting and creative, but the panels all around the Sistine Chapel have sibling oracles. What I want to do is give you a window. You've already heard the author of Revelation speak to foreign about trouble coming at the ragged edge of time from the eastern edge of the empire. You've heard now from the eccentric professor who's, just pontificating ad nausea about, if you look at intertestamental history, you can look at the story of Parthia and the world there. Now what I want to do is take you to literature. And if you look at the sibling oracles, what's particularly interesting is you'll see herein these authors, or author, sees trouble coming at the ragged edge of time from east to the Euphrates, and gives a window into it. Now, which lets you know that whatever you're hearing in Revelation, whatever you think you're hearing, just because you're hearing it from the first time when you read it, doesn't mean they're hearing it from the first time when John is read to them. I want to pick up, and I'm just going to read you through some of these sources. And I was going to spend some time, though I don't think I will, from Eva Sanford, called Nero and the East. It's Harvard Studies of Classical Philology. Philology speaks of language, but I'll kind of refer to this a little. And what she's doing here is working through some text. Now, you're going to take leave of the moment with me, and I want you to enter into this time machine. In book 4, verse 115, an evil storm of war will come upon Jerusalem from Italy, and it will sack the great temple of God. And a great king will flee from Italy like a runaway slave, unseen and unheard, over the channel of the Euphrates. There's this evil king, according to the section here, who vacates Italy and runs and goes over to the Euphrates. We're told here, moving on to 137, the strife of war will be aroused and it will come to the west. So there's this runaway personality who goes to the east of the Euphrates and then brings war from that part of the world westward. We're told here, war will be aroused from the west, and the fugitive from Rome will come, brandishing a great spear, having crossed the Euphrates with many myriads. Now, a myriad is 1,000. A myriad is thousands of thousands. Myriads, with the S, it's thousands of thousands. It's a great source. And by the way, if you look at Revelation, when he talks about the army coming from the east, it says 200 million. There isn't even a word in Greek for 200 million. They don't even, they didn't even know how to go that high. Now it's easy. All you just have to look at is free tuition that's been given back. Now we just print money. Like they didn't even, no one even was working with language like that. But here he says that here this personality is going to come with myriads from the Euphrates. I'm going to go to Oracle 5. See here. And by the way, if you're saying, Jeffrey, I'm glad you're excited, but when is this thing ending? Don't worry, we're getting there. It's like a flight, it's you wondering, my God, I'm getting tired on this airplane. No, the pilot knows the pilot can see the lights ahead. You can't see it. You got to trust me. I see the lights. In a moment, you're going to start feeling, you know what it's like on the airplane where you're sitting there, then you hear, thump. There's this, it's like the bay opens underneath and the wheels come down. You go, that's a sound worth hearing. Then you start to get some sense of, you're kind of descending a little bit. So if you're feeling, you're hearing landing gear coming down, you don't know when the crazy guy's finished talking, but if you think you can feel the landing gear and the altitude, you're correct. Okay, now, book 5. The Persian will come onto your soil like hail, and he will destroy your land, and evil devising men with blood and corpses by terrible altars, a savage-minded man, much bloodied, raving nonsense, with a full host, numerous as sand, bringing destruction on you. There is this great war coming from the east, and we're getting behind one inherently evil personality who's going to be identified here. And if you look in the Sibyls, this wicked person who's coming, we're used to the second coming of Christ. This is the second coming of Nero. If you look earlier in Revelation, there's this beast, this inherently evil personality, the mark of the beast, 666, that cryptic designation. If you look at the numerical equivalence of Nero's name, it's 666, arguably. What happens is Nero dies. Nero's this madman. And he's going to flame out. But he sneaks away and evil is reincarnated. Now we know this personality as the Antichrist, this inherently evil personality who invests energies to bring about this bloodied, miserable world. The siblings identify this person as Nero, and Nero reappears in the east across the Euphrates and then comes with the treacherous assault on Rome. That's why from the Harvard Classic it's titled Nero and the East. And what we're looking at here is working with some of the literature I'm going to read to you and develop with other sources. In any case, moving on. Go to the east. We're looking in 114. Go to the east, to the mindless tribes of the Persians, and show them now is what will be. The current of the river Euphrates will bring on a flood, and will destroy Persians, Iberians, and Babylonians who love war and trust in bows. There's a great war. He goes on to say in 137, the poets will bewail thrice wretched Greece when a great king of great Rome, a godlike man from Italy, will cut the ridge of the isthmus. Him, they say, Zeus himself begot, and Lady Hera, playing at theatricals with honey-sweet songs rendered with melodious voice. He will destroy many men and his wretched mother. By the way, Nero was guilty of matricide. He killed his own mother. And Nero was, he was maddened that the Latins insulted him. Instead of being concerned with state, he loved theater. He saw himself as a great actor. He's this madman with this lust of this bloodlust. And here, there's this description of the second coming of Nero, who leads the army from the east. And he says, he will flee from Babylon, a terrible and shameless prince, whom all mortals and noble men despise. He was the last of the Julians, and he was hated. If you look in book 5, looking at verse 360, now it sounds like you're quoting the Bible, but if you look at these references on scrolls, you give references so scholars can know where to land when you're referring to things. Again, I'm giving books and numbers. In my own mind, I'm not quoting the Bible, but just the literature. There will come to pass in the last time, you know, at the end of days, there will come to pass in the last time about the waning of the moon, a war which shall throw the world into confusion and be deceptive in guile. There's this great war. A man who is a matricide will come from the ends of the earth. And again, a matricide, to kill your mother. A man who's matricide will come from the ends of the earth in flight and devising penetrating schemes in his mind. He will destroy every land and conquer all. He will destroy many men and great rulers, and he will set fire to all men as no one else ever did. Well, I could go on. What do I want to do here? I want to look at intertestamental literature. If you look in the New Testament, there's a story about this great struggle that's precipitated by forces unleashed from east to the Euphrates that sweep into the west. If you look at intertestamental history with the Parthians, this tension, this intrigue, Roman positions itself concerned about incursions from the east, nipping away at the Roman Empire. If you look at literature from the era, you find ways that authors give voice to this concern as well. What emerges when we read first century biblical literature with a first century set of eyes? I asked you at the outset, it's easy to look at the Iranian Menace today, and you can look at Revelation and bingo. But I said, just refrain from making any executive decision, interpretive decisions. Rather than try and understand an interesting text with a 21st century lens, let's go with century 1. What emerges? Well, this is my own. I postulate, that is, I formally put forth. Whatever you think you see, that's your business. Here's what I think I see when I look at it. Depictions of horrific judgments are noted in Revelation 16, 1 and on. Here he says he pours out the bowl of the great Euphrates. That if you look at the sibling oracles, there's the periodization of history. These woes are poured out. These woes are poured out. When you look at Revelation 16, it's the same genre, the same type. He says there's depictions of horrific judgments that are noted. With Armageddon, finally, a last days evil empire is described in Revelation and its destruction is foretold in the 17th chapter into the 18th as well. The archetypal evil emperor, Nero, in century 1 appears in apocryphal pseudepigraphical literature. The Sibylline oracles in 4, 5, and 8 envision Nero leading an end-time assault. Christ's return and the triumph of the evil empire is then celebrated after chapter 18 and chapter 19. And finally, harking to a Genesis motif, an ancient serpent in Revelation is seized and bound. Earth becomes a restored Eden-like paradise. That's when I look at the first century literature from a with the first century lens, that's kind of the story that emerges for me. Now, what I want to do is, I want to finish up real quick, but I want to begin with another picture. I'd mentioned that I want to bookend this. I wanted to look at primary source data, and I said I wanted to look at eschatology and protology, last things and first things, that can kind of give an understanding of what we're looking at. I mention that because what you're looking at here is a map of the ancient, we're looking here, the ancient Near Eastern world. This is the Mediterranean here. This is Canaan and Lebanon. This is Mesopotamia. Here's the Euphrates River. Here's the Tigris River. Iran is over here, just on the other side there of the Zagros Mountains. That's where we are. Now, when you look at biblical literature, if you look at Bereshit, if you look at Genesis, Revelation has a story of an assault. There's the evil outside of this world here that then impinges upon it and makes its way here for this climactic struggle. That's the story that's told. Whatever it means spiritually, whenever it is, and whoever. I mean, it's this war that moves over here. War from the east moves west. And we see that in biblical literature. Now, that's at the end of the Bible. If you look at the beginning of the Bible, I'm kind of harking back to, I want to end really where I began and where the story begins. If you look at the Revelation story, there's the Armageddon conflict, and then the serpent is seized and thrown into the pit, and paradise restored, tree of life. The sorrow and sighing flees, tears are wiped away from the eyes. It's paradise restored. Now, when you go to the Genesis story, Bereshit, Genesis, if you ask the question, where is this geographically? Because I've been interested in geography here. I mean, the Bible sets up, we're talking about geography in this ancient Near Eastern world over here. If you look at Genesis, there's Gan Eden, there's paradise, and it's placed, there are these 4 rivers that are associated. Now, if you want to, listen, if I wanted to talk about geology, it's beyond my pay grade. I was talking to a guy earlier about oil. He can talk about that. You want to talk about, earth shifting, continental shifts and plates. It's beyond my pay grade. But I can tell you this. If you look at a globe, if you look at the continents on the earth, not on a globe, but if you just had it on like a piece of paper, if you look at these continents, it looks like, it looks like land that broke up, and you could push it back together again into something something happened. I can't speak about time and circumstance, and I'm not an expert in early Genesis. I don't have a dog in that fight. There are people in this church that are smarter than me. But if you look at this, you have these continents that broke up. Now, I mention that if you look at these great rivers, if people ask, where was Eden? Well, it's associated with these rivers. Now, if you look at the, if you look at there's the Nile over here, the Tigris and the Euphrates. There's a land that broke out, that spread out. There's a cogent argument that Israel is where Eden was. That's why when you look at the story when you go back to Bereshit, to Genesis, you have Adam and Chava. They're kicked out of Eden, and they're forced to go east. And there you have these cheruvim, these guardian angels that are there with this flaming sword to keep them from coming back. That is, that Eden is defiled by their presence. And you have the story of being kicked out to the east. Not long after that, when you look at the Bible in Genesis through the end of the Bible, there's a story about a man named Avram, who was a Hebrew. He wasn't a Jew, he was a Hebrew. The word Hebrew etymologically comes from a word meaning beyond the river. If you look at Abram, he had a Kuwaiti passport. Kuwaiti. And what happens is he makes a journey along Mesopotamia, a Greek word meaning between the rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, and the family hunkers down here in Padan Aram, Syria. And then Abraham goes here. If you look at the Bible story, there's this, you have people in Eden that are kicked out, but then there's this press, this impulse to go back to the promised land, the holy land, the sacred land. You have this making his way east, from the east to the west, Abraham. And then they live in the land, but they're sinful. God exacts a punishment, and they're kicked out of the land. If you look at the biblical story, they're in Canaan, the disobedient, they're taken off into captivity in Babylon. But then there's the grace of God, and they're allowed to go back to the land. You have this in and out of the land, even into the modern era. I mentioned this earlier, that it's a problem that Christians have, because when we think of our inheritance and our promise, the Christian is tethered to a different contract. We're told that our commonwealth is in heaven, and from it we await a Savior. There's a sense in which the great reward is on the other side of the fence. Jesus said, I go away to prepare a place for you, and when I come again, I will take you. But relative to earth, we're told that here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city which is to come. From a Christian perspective, the promise is on the other side of the grave. W.D. Davies at Duke University says it's precisely for that reason that Christians have understanding the Older Testament, where the Older Testament religion is tethered to real estate. There's the sense in which they were in the land. Adam and Eve were kicked out of the land. Abraham goes back to the land. If they're disobedient, they're kicked out of the land, but then they go back to the land. And there's a judgment. And here we are now, if you look at movement and history and prophecy, Jews are back in the land. So you have this is the land, and there's trouble over here. And they go back and forth, back and forth. It looks like that struggle. Not only do you find it in the early pages of Genesis, you find it in the last pages of Revelation. My question to you is, so what? Well, thank you for, it's long for a sermon, but this really isn't church. You're here, God bless you, because and I'm honored too. People will go to church on a Wednesday and a Sunday just because it's part of the society. If you're coming out on a Thursday, it's more than that. You're not just socialized into religion in some sense. There's an interest in the subject, and I'm honored that you would offer me a hearing. What do you want to do with this, if anything? What do you think the Iranian menace in Jewish history and prophecy? The eccentric professor says, well, there's something to it. That part of the world, what do you want to do with it? Discoveries, tentative hypotheses. I like people that are confident, but I don't like dogmatic. That is, what do we think we see? Sometimes we can think we see something, and that's great. In light of newer information, we might have to adjust it some, maybe jettison it entirely in light of something that's crisper. But nevertheless, where we sit, what are we looking at? When you look at the story, you've been playing around in the crazy professor's lab. We've looked at literature, history, and tentative hypothesis. Do you think there are any connections between yesterday's prophecies and today's world? The Iranian menace in Jewish history and prophecy. Is there an Iranian menace in Jewish history? Yes. Is there an Iranian menace in ancient literature? Yes. Is there an Iranian menace today? Yes. Is it one big cosmic coincidence? Is it something bigger than that? What say you? Thank you so much for coming out tonight and studying the Iranian menace. I might have 10 of these books in the foyer. If you want, go ahead and I think they're $20. Pastor Steve, thank you very much. God bless you.